Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Sungjun,
Oh, hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Product.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today, we are releasing a very special edition of this podcast, talking about breaking news that we saw online recently. So, one of the major blend house, Marukyu Koyamaen, is publicly apologizing to consumers about they will be literally running out of selling matcha by the end of the year.
Yeah, pretty shocking announcement. And for the rest of this episode, for pronunciation's sake and for speed and efficiency, we're just going to refer to them as MK, especially because my Japanese pronunciation is so poor. I'll save embarrassing myself. But, it's a pretty shocking announcement. I mean, the announcement is literally like, hey, we might run out of matcha. And coming from one of the largest, most established traditional blend houses, that was pretty shocking and sent some waves through the internet sphere. And a lot of people are giving commentary. So we find this like really worthy of like breaking news in the matcha industry and wanted to sort of investigate further.
Yeah, this is literally like Nike posting about, they're running out of shoes to be sold, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Really crazy. So we reached out to a bunch of former guests on the show to source their opinion and to gather different perspectives other than our own. So we're structuring this podcast sort of as a breaking news segment. We're recording this at the very last minute before we're publishing it. So the format's going to be a little different. We're going to talk about the announcement itself and then kind of give some highlights of the online commentary that's out there in public. And then we asked a bunch of people their opinions who had very different perspectives on the industry, including Cole, My Matcha Addiction, who's a sort of matcha influencer and reviewer, what he thought. We reached out to Ian from Yunomi. Both of them are former guests. And Ian runs Yunomi, which is the largest marketplace of artisanal Japanese tea online, and works a lot with small tea farmers. So it's a really great perspective. And then we reached out to a tea farmer, Pau, who is a future guest on an episode that is yet to be released, who also runs the blog Tea Nursery, which is a fantastic resource, especially if you want to learn more about production areas or cultivars. And he's like literally deep in the weeds as a tea farmer himself, working in Kyoto Prefecture. So we sourced these different opinions and we've kind of amalgamated it all together in this episode to hopefully give a pretty enriching breakdown of not only like what is this announcement, but what are its implications and why is there not enough tea, and what are the bottlenecks that are causing this issue.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to kind of review different perspective coming from different parties because our first thought is that like this will really push consumers to kind of explore around to maybe down to more niche, more boutique production or producers out there in Japan other than MK. But it seems like the situation is much more complex than we thought.
Much more. Actually, my very first reaction seeing the headline was, wow, that's great. Like matcha is really having its moment. Seeing a company like them sell out and nearly run out of matcha, I mean, it just shows that this movement's really growing. When you read through the online discourse, there are actually some pretty negative externalities about that we're going to touch on in the episodes. Like anything, it's really complex. And it's interesting to see all these different opinions and kind of view the same thing from many different perspectives. So let's move on to the first segment, which is the announcement itself. And we're going to read off part of it from Instagram itself. So the title is Apology and Announcement Regarding Quantity Limit Restriction on Matcha Products and the Current Situation. So, dear customers, due to a sharp and continued increase in demand of matcha products in the past few months, the current demand is already over our production capacity. This results in extreme low stock of all matcha products at this moment. It goes on to say that they're doing their absolute best to keep up with the demand and that it's only possible for them to procure tea once a year. So there's very little that they can do at this point. And therefore, they regret that a quantity limit restriction is now applied on all matcha products to ensure that it can reach as many customers as possible while stocks last. And it also says here in the middle that there will be a high possibility of a complete out of stock before the next harvest season arrives. That's crazy. And it's even more crazy because the next harvest season, you're not immediately making matcha. When you harvest the tea leaves, process it to tencha, and then mill it, typically that undergoes a resting period, which is a point that Pa made. These products sometimes age for usually around 6 months and they get released in the fall. But they can also be aged for a year or two to help kind of cut off the bitterness, because a lot of the bitter and astringent catechins degrade faster than the amino acid compounds, which are more umami. So it's a way of sort of transforming a flavor profile to mellow it out by aging it even more. So it must be very tricky from a stock management, even keeping older stocks to create a lot of these blends that they have. So it's crazy. I don't know. Sam, or Zongjun, what was your first reaction when reading through the post sort of in their own language, in the way that they phrase things?
Yeah, it's interesting that they are actually doing some measurements of limiting people to buy their tea so that they can have enough tea to offer to more customers. Like I read part of the comment section too that people are complaining that like they go to their physical location in Japan and only to learn that there isn't enough tea for them, or the tea that they want to buy is out of stock. Like it's kind of crazy that people running into situations like this where they travel so far away from the other side of the world only to learn that something is not available anymore.
That's crazy. And MK is not the only company that this is happening to. There are a lot of these traditional houses that have been out of stock. Even MK themselves have had extremely low stocks over the past couple of months. And now they're basically saying, hey, we might run out of tea. So they're not even the only people that it's affecting. Zongjun and I were on the phone the day after this came out. And our initial reaction was, hey, this is going to move consumers into a state of exploration. People have built this habit. Maybe they found great value with a lot of these products and a lot of these blends. It's going to push them into a mode of exploration, just like you do anytime you don't have access to whatever you've built a habit with. And it might benefit the other tea companies that do have matcha stocks and might be less known. And this might just be a case of having like these awareness pockets and sets of matcha consumers where it's slightly more winner takes all, like because people are aware of these companies and they have great reputations and so many people are aware. And a lot of these hype cycles are being driven by platforms like Instagram and TikTok, right? A lot of the market share goes to them. And maybe this will be an opportunity for other less known companies to get more market share and for consumers to build preferences and new habits with some companies that get less love online. And as we talk to more people, we realize that might be the case, but also there's a lot of complexities and externalities.
Yeah. It might even be the opposite of the case, as we learned that a lot of these smaller houses are actually depending on these larger houses on their production capacity. And in normal years, like these larger houses might have overcapacity so that they can, kind of give them to smaller houses for processing their teas. But right now they are running out of their capacity themselves. Like all these smaller houses might end up not having any capacity to process their tea, which is shocking to learn. Very surprising and really caught my attention as I was reading Paul's reply on our question.
And it's not just the tea industry that does this sort of thing. I know it's a big thing in craft beer. It's a really, just like building a tencha factory is a huge investment in capital, equipment, and land and risk. But you have all of this equipment that's sitting there, and typically you need to build it above your capacity so you can grow into your equipment. So as you produce more, as you sell more, you can create more, because there's no point in building a factory that's exactly at the limits of what you're selling now. So even in industries like beer, it's very common to do contract brewing. So that equipment's not just sitting there, it can make money brewing, other people's recipes to create their products and then, package it using their packaging. It's a huge thing to make sure that you're kind of squeezing the most out of your equipment. But what happens when there's a huge explosion from the equipment owners, right? They're the ones who have the leverage and they need that capacity now. It could actually be a very negative externality for these smaller players that are reliant on other people's capital equipment for processing.
Yeah, that's right. They really have no leverage. And right now, it's extremely expensive to build new facilities and procure new machineries for all of these shiage process to process alercha. We learned that the last wave of construction of such facilities was about a decade ago, and it has been a long time since any of these new factories being built.
And apparently, in a lot of in certain tea growing prefectures, it's not as easy as just building a new building, right? Because you have to work with the local land and the local geography. And we were learning that in Kyoto Prefecture, there's a lot of repurposing of old buildings that get turned into tea factories, just
Mm.
simply because there's not enough land or they can't use the land in certain ways. They kind of have to work with a lot of existing infrastructure. Whereas in like places like Kagoshima, which are extremely large and flat, you can just build this gigantic facility. Whereas in like some areas in Kyoto, it's just not the case, which is something that Paul told us when we met him in Japan.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. So, Ryan, let's look back to the original post made by MK, and I was fascinated about the comment section underneath, as a lot of people are blaming TikTok as the main contributor. I would say. What do you think about that?
This is particularly weird for us, and I don't know anyone who's listening on this that's not on TikTok, because we are not either. So I would say this was a blind spot for us on our like news ecosystem. And it was really interesting because actually, backing up one step further, the first comment that I saw reacting to this news on Instagram was from Jacques and Matcha, as a matcha business in the Philippines. And she was talking about all of this overconsumption. And she wrote, matcha used to be consumed on special occasions like tea ceremonies, and that hoarding and overconsumption doesn't look cool. And when I first read this, I actually was pretty confused. I didn't quite get it. And then I also read from Matcha Moments in the Philippines as well, discussing how matcha is, a really premium product and how many people are drinking all this great matcha and gulping it down in the form of a latte, without thinking about it or knowing what this product is. Right? They're just people with a lot of buying power, buying this great stuff, and we'll call it watering it down, or
You know, Ryan, as a Chinese, and I this really reminds me of how people were complaining about all of these vintage Chateau Lafite getting procured and gulped by all of these businessmen in business parties in China, and there's just not enough supply for elsewhere in the world. And people were blending like a green tea into the wine and drink it as a whole. Let me add some Kanshifu green tea into it, make it more drinkable.
I didn't really understand this commentary completely until I was talking with Cole. And this is what he wrote. I was asking him what he thought about this overconsumption argument. And he said, yeah, I think TikTok has really pushed overconsumption. I think that people just literally don't understand how fast matcha goes bad. I see people having full drawers or shelves of matcha, all unrefrigerated and all half consumed. I was like, whoa, you're right. I guess I have seen that a little bit on Instagram, that there's this whole culture of like building up your matcha stash. And like, there's no way people are drinking that before it goes bad. And it is kind of a waste. And I had never really quite considered that. And he was
Yeah.
commenting how someone had recently commented on one of his posts that they think he does a very good job keeping low stocks and keeping matcha fresh, like as it's intended to be. Like the first real thread in reaction to this news is a culture of overconsumption.
I guess it's inevitable. in their defense, it's inevitable for a lot of the beginners to kind of, especially in their exploration phase, to really have a stash of matcha because they probably want to try what all these matcha taste like. And I mean, like I have been through similar phase for tea, for coffee, for wine, for spirits. The only problem for matcha is that it really doesn't age. It's like it really is a fresh fruit. It's very different from other things out there that people might be migrating from.
True. And that just doesn't copy and paste over to matcha. But, it's good and bad, right? You have a bunch of people buying a bunch of stuff, forming preferences, deciding what they like or don't like, or where they find good value or bad value. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of stale matcha that could have gone to someone who would drink it. It's kind of like a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset. And like in a scarcity world, like what you said with Chateau Lafitte, right? Like it's a bit of a shame that people who it's not even people who don't even appreciate. Let's assume that they appreciate all the flavors and can taste it and understand the history. Even if they do, right? It's still like it's going bad.
Yeah, but that is really hard though, like because you do have a growing demand and like growing amount of people that are curious about trying more. And what are you going to do with them? Like stop giving them tea or like who is there to judge like you know nothing about matcha, like people making those judgments was once a beginner too, right? Like they probably went
Mm,
through a very similar phase.
very true.
And looping back to the Chinese wine consumption, like you had that crazy phase about buying only Chateau Lafite from the creme de la creme. But decades later, right now, you have a very interesting Chinese wine culture and Chinese wine, appreciation scene here going on. People are saturated, and like those who are really into wine start, taking wine seriously, start even growing wine and producing wine in China. And without those initial craze, like no one will essentially care about it at all.
Mm,
So I bet
yeah,
that,
it's
matcha is inevitably going to go through a very similar phase as, there just will be people flooding into the market and eventually, like those people who treat it as a hype will leave and then left with those who truly care and they will become experienced drinker in the future.
yeah, absolutely. Or form their own little like subculture, right? Like
Uh-huh.
something that we've talked about before. If you look at like tea culture in Britain, they were importing Chinese tea, but they certainly were not importing any Chinese tea culture. And it can evolve into its own thing. And in a similar way, just like how you see people buying really good matcha and putting a giant scoop of agave into it and then whisking it up, right? To a purist, that's horrifying. And there's an interesting comment here in the comment threads. Actually, I think this was the most liked comment under MK's post. And it says, TikTokers ruining tea. Get 115 likes. And then people say, someone finally said it. I'm so annoyed. Someone else said, so true. And then if you keep reading down, someone commented on how TikTok mania in America is mixing precious matcha with Oatly. And now there's not enough matcha for tea ceremony practitioners.
Well, the funny thing is, we were at Hori Shichimen and the lady there told us that this matcha is good with Oatly or oat milk.
It's interesting getting purist perspectives and then having a more open mind. People might really like it mixed with other things.
It's a little bit unfortunate to see this dilemma exist for the time being. Because I do understand that, like people get angry about, things that they really appreciate and things that they not only they appreciate, they are not able to buy at the moment, and seeing them being kind of in their in their eyes spoiled with other things. I can relate to the anger, but also at the same time, like maybe that's the reality that we need to deal with.
Oh, yeah. Why? You can't change consumers.
You
Anytime
cannot
like
change
people are
consumers.
blaming consumers, it's too hard, right? This industry is in service to consumers, whether or not they're tea ceremony practitioners or whether or not they're people who enjoy matcha in a latte. And that's just the reality. And no amount of huffing and puffing is going to change that. And this is just for fun, some very nice, amusing pinnacle of online discourse. Someone wrote, Seems like it's time to increase capacities and to buy some more land to harvest tea. To which someone responded, that's not how it works. Tea plants are not green beans. Wonderful sampling of some of this delightful discourse that exists within the online tea community. One interesting thing in the comment threads was talking about limited stocks for people traveling to Japan, and it seemed to be a pretty big topic where people would say, I'm traveling all the way to Japan. I want to buy it there. I planned my whole trip around this, and please save it for retail sales versus selling it online. To which a lot of people respond, and this is a quote from someone, I live in France and I drink matcha for years now. And trust me when I say that European brands of matcha aren't worth it. Online sales of great matcha gardens like MK, like Hori, Shishimayan, Iporo are truly a gift for people like me. And there were other people echoing that sentiment. So, there are no right answers to this stuff. It is very complicated. And what do you do in a world of scarcity? And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially if they do run out of matcha. It'll be
Yeah,
interesting to see
it's
how it plays out.
like on one hand, you have people like really diehard matcha lovers traveling all the way from their own country to Japan, maybe for the first time ever. And they're so excited and prepared to buy this matcha that they have been loving at the physical location that they want to visit, and only to learn that the tea is sold out. But on the other hand, you have people who cannot probably afford to go to Japan or plan the whole trip, and can only rely on online sales to try all of these wonderful things. It's really hard to assess the situation, because for me, I think that everyone should have the freedom to try good matcha. You should not stop anyone from buying anything. That's just not fair. It's almost create a man-made obstacle for someone to assess something, and that's just not fair for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That matcha culture, exists out of retail sales in Japan, and that people have built businesses, people have built habits, and people have built lifestyles or tea ceremony communities that need to be supplied, and that exist outside of Japan, right? From all of the culture that Japan has exported. I totally agree. So we reached out to, as I said, a couple different people. One of them was Cole from My Matcha Addiction, asking him his thoughts in general, and then Ian and Pa as well. And we're going to kind of put them in this order because their commentary kind of flows very nicely into to understand where the bottlenecks are, why the bottlenecks are the way that they are, and then understanding the secondary and tertiary outcomes of the fact that there is this shortage. So Cole wrote, there are a ton of matcha brands that pop up almost every day, and it seems like they all seem to be sourcing from the same handful of farmers. Speaking, Zongjun and I have went to Japan. This is so real. Anyone doing sourcing abroad, it is hard to find farmers, especially farmers that are willing to meet with you, and kind of have to rely on what's in English or finding people through Instagram. And it is very easy to discover someone else's supplier, even by accident, if not intentionally. So that is so real the more we learn about sourcing in Japan, and we have a whole series coming out about that.
Yeah. For a lot of the teas, it's just the same tea getting repackaged into different brands.
And then it's interesting, like, oh, whoa, I know exactly who this person bought that from. I can
Uh-huh.
perfectly pattern match it. I'm like, interesting. This person's charging $28 a can. This person's only charging 22. Like, I know this is the same product. Anyway, we won't make any enemies, so we'll stop the commentary there. But Cole goes on to say, I do worry that to meet demand, either quality goes down or price goes up. And that, in his opinion, I think it would be price that goes up in the short term. And in the long term, he says he could see more farms pivoting towards 10-shot production, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But it does seem to be the consensus that price goes up. And it kind of makes sense, right? Classic supply and demand dynamics. What do you think about MK raising prices? Do you think that's the right move, or do you think just limiting stock? Well, clearly they've decided just to limit stock and not to raise prices. But what if they did raise prices and not limit stock?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as what they said in the announcement, they are trying everything. So I guess they just have to try things and figure out what's the best solution for the situation. Because like this is probably like the first time they are running into a situation like this.
In their 300-year history. They were founded in 1704. Kind of crazy.
Yeah, that is not so much younger than Ming Dynasty China.
And this is not a small business, by the way, just to put it into context. If you do some basic research on this company, this is a huge range, but it gives you a sense of how big they are. It's estimated they do between $10 to $50 million in revenue a year. A pretty large business, and I don't know how accurate or up to date this number is. And it's a huge range, but they're a pretty significant supplier to the quote unquote matcha economy.
Hmm.
So we also reached out to Ian from Yunomi, who is an incredible wealth of knowledge, especially because his perspective is working so closely with so many small Japanese tea farmers, like hundreds of them. And so he has a sense of like the pulse of what's going on in the industry. And so we're very thankful that he gave his perspective. And he thinks that demand is largely driven by tourism in Japan. And he kind of separates matcha into two very distinct markets. You have domestic, which is grown because of tourism, and then you have international, which needs to be compliant for different regulatory agencies in the countries that are importing these products from Japan. And there has been a huge boom in tourism in Japan in general. And Japan retail places and cafes are, and this is something Ian was telling us in person when we met him in Tokyo a few months ago, was that cafes are now putting matcha on their menu, not because Japanese customers want matcha or a matcha latte. It's because all the foreigners that are coming to Japan expect it to be on those menus. So even
Yeah.
in Japan, there's this scramble to get enough supply in places where it traditionally wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of saw the situation, very similar situation in some of the offline physical stores of these traditional houses. For example, we were in Ryoen in Kyoto, and we were there to buy some tea and try their teas. And for about half an hour of us being in the store, there were just tourists and very, very old Japanese men. And it's just very fascinating to see the demographic of consumers in those physical stores.
It's really foreign driven, and you can really feel that when you're in Japan too.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if you talk to like really local Japanese people and you're talking about matcha, it's very apparent it is not cool. Like maybe their mother or grandmother studied tea ceremony, and that's the extent to which they know or talk about matcha or care. Like it's like their, older generation's obscure hobby is
Yeah.
the impression that I get talking to like local people in Tokyo.
Yeah, like getting into matcha or working on matcha is almost like sounds like getting into weaving for a lot of the younger people in Japan. So very interesting to see how people assess this thing from different countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have these two very distinct markets, and in some ways they're intertwined, right? Because you have the domestic market, which the growth is being driven by foreigners, and you also have the foreign market, and obviously the growth is being driven by foreigners, which is a lot of where this interest is coming from. So I'm going to read this directly from my conversation with Ian. So he says, overseas import brands at any scale are importing compliant matcha, which is lower in price and in quality, meaning more bitter, less umami, and less body than what is sold in Japan. So if we divide this into Japan compliant and overseas matcha, demand for both are very high, but coming from different markets. The effect on supply for both are similar, though. It puts pressure on supply. So that was the end of this quote. And Pa also reiterated this over and over and over about how this puts pressure on supply. And Pa, later on in this podcast, is talking about the different bottlenecks in matcha production and how it's putting all of this pressure. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But going back to Ian's comments, while overseas compliant matcha production can expand, Japan compliant matcha has significant limitations, I think. And meanwhile, I do see more overseas entrepreneurs asking for Japan compliant matcha without knowing the regulations they need to abide by. Compliance for the US can be solved by the EPA establishing safety limits on pesticide residue based on research, reviewed research done in Japan. Taiwan and the EU take a much stricter approach in general, though, so it's unlikely. Either way, demand will push up prices, and import brands will either have to raise prices or sacrifice their excessively high margins. But for supply, for high-grade matcha, I don't see it expanding much. Yes, we have more and more farms switching to tencha production. The industry could build more tencha factories, but any farmer co-op now that has sencha factories and that have sencha factories and replacing that or adding existing factories will be difficult. And this is the next part that Ian says really made me pause and think, is that more than that, the demand being from foreigners creates a situation where you have a piece of Japanese culture that is being consumed by non-Japanese, and if at the expense of leaf tea or loose leaf tea, then that is in a way a destruction of Japanese tea culture rather than spreading it. That is a really interesting negative externality that I wasn't thinking about. That you can, there's a lot of tea made in Japan that's not tencha. But if you switch it over to tencha production, that has to be at the expense of something else.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting phenomenon. I guess you kind of see that in other industry too. It's going to use a Chinese tea example. In China, in certain tea regions, you start to see some major cultivars or major type of tea overtaking the entire region's production. Whereas in some traditional regions, not only you produce oolong, you sometimes produce some green tea, some red tea, some white tea. Now are just exclusively producing, Da Hong Pao or exclusively one certain type of cultivar. And they are just eradicating gardens that have been grown or farmed for centuries and transform the entire production into one specific cultivar. And it's happening in China, and for very similar reason. I don't see that I don't see Japan has any immunity to this kind of a situation. So
Yeah.
I agree with Ian.
And it seems to be getting worse. So Ian was later on saying that a famous tea growing region in Kyoto Prefecture, he was on the phone with a small farmer earlier that day, and he was saying that big factories are setting up these corporate farms leased from older farmers. And these big corporate farms, he said, are shading the field for all harvests, even autumn, which weakens the plants and lowers the quality. So the sense is that the priority right now is not focusing on quality, it's focusing on quantity. And as more of these farmers age out, that's probably a pretty attractive thing. Big corporate comes in, takes over the operations, and they have all the equipment and process that they need to then process that tea and bring it to market. Sounds like a pretty attractive proposal. These huge blending houses, I won't speak about MK specifically, but blending houses in general don't have transparent labels. When you look at their product, they don't tell you if it's first harvest. Sometimes they do if it's like a special product, but they're mainstream brands. They don't tell you anything about it. Where it was from, how it was grown, what the cultivars were used, what the blend composition is, if the blend includes things like not first flush tea. So in a way, it's a way of increasing supply, but you can hide behind this obscurity or lack of specialty standards.
Yeah, that's a very sad, but I can't really think of any remedy to counter with this situation because people are making more money growing tencha, and there is a growing demand of matcha in the world. And you don't have that for kapuse cha, for cookie cha, for fukamushi cha. You just do not. Maybe there is a demand for hoji cha, which I think is very much the case. That's really, there's nothing that can help with the situation.
Yeah. And in some ways, if you look from a tea plant perspective, it's sad. If you look from the tea farmer's perspective, it's sad. If you look at like this consolidation that's going on and the fact that power is getting concentrated, right? There's aspects of that are bad. And if you're just looking through the lens of the consumer and you're asking, how do you get more matcha faster? Blending and lack of transparency is actually a fantastic way to subtly decrease quality by increasing quantity greatly. Like, it
Mhm.
is a solution to creating more high quality products, because with a skilled blender,
Yeah.
you can blend out flaws and you can achieve profiles that you get.
And
Maybe on net, right? The algebra there, quality slightly lowers, but it is a kind of a way of creating this, like, it's like matcha's fungible. Like, if there's an inflation, you can create more of it by
yeah, yeah,
just
like
harvesting it more often.
and with all these obscured poetic names, you are almost creating a fake diversity. But in fact, it's really just all different Yabukita and Okumidori getting blend together. But yeah, that's a very interesting situation.
Pretty elegant solution in the short term, albeit kind of sad as a tea person. And it just goes to show, it's you can view this stuff so differently depending on if you really put Japanese culture first, if you put tea farmers' livelihoods first, if you put consumers first, if you put the heritage of the products first. There's like all these different viewpoints that you can project positive or negative externalities to for supply shortages like this announcement.
Yeah, yeah. Like it really depends on the perspective. Like let's see if we are, really going to preserve this cultural diversity, this product diversity of Japanese tea. Like, what are we going to do with it? Like, we stop exportation. We you know kind of restrict the market to be all of these teas to be consumed within Japan. And now what? Like you have a aging population, you have a shrinking population of consumer. Younger generation is not really getting into drinking tea, and you also have farmers that are getting old. So if you really look inward, that you have a shrinking market and a shrinking industry for like the higher end boutique production of Japanese tea.
These problems are so complex.
It's almost a little bit desperate to think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no good solutions. Culture will be. I mean, one thing is for certain. Like, quality is probably going to go down. Prices are probably going to go up. Culture is probably going to be lost. New culture is probably going to be made, and you have a whole set of new consumers that can enjoy this thing that didn't even know that it existed 10 years ago. And this is a bit of a tangent, but Michael Pollan, the food writer, has a very interesting flip in perspective. If you read some of his books or some of his works, he puts the main character usually being the food or the plant. Like, how did rice take advantage of humans, or corn take advantage of humans to spread to every corner of the earth? And if you do the same thing with matcha, it's an interesting thought exercise if you put it as the primary character and how it is taking over the world and the different ways that it has quote unquote used humans to get there. I'm not saying that's the right framing, but it's an interesting thought experiment. Because from that perspective, matcha's doing pretty well. So last segment of this is this very detailed response that we got back from Pa from Tea Nursery, which we'll also have him on the podcast in quite a few episodes from now, probably 5 or 6. We have quite the backlog of content, but it was a fantastic episode. He's super knowledgeable, and his work, other than his blog, is he's a tea farmer in Kyoto Prefecture. And he did a really excellent job for us, at least for us, understanding what some of the bottlenecks are in the supply that lead to shortages like at MK. Let's start with the one that is like literally the plants and processing and cultivation. So he wrote, Tencha and other shaded teas like Gokuro and Kabuse require a lot more attention during the growing phase. The cultivation involves meticulous application of shading, ensuring the correct timing and avoiding potential disruptions like windstorms that could damage buds or open the shading cover. And this is just one example of growing differences that have to be considered. Let's not even talk about pruning, fertilization, or any particularities of cultivar itself, aside from the additional costs in labor, tools, and equipment to grow those teas. So that is like really interesting in that, like, yes, farmers can pivot from growing other types of tea like sencha to growing
It's
tencha.
not that easy.
It's not that easy. And I feel like this is a pretty like high level answer. Probably you could write like a PhD dissertation on the complexities of switching over. That even we won't ever understand. But that was really nice encapsulation of getting a taste of what that would be like. Something else he talks a lot about are factories and just the processing of tencha. As Ian mentioned, there's just not enough tencha factories in a lot of cases. And something we talked about previously is that, a lot of the production capacity that's owned by the big companies get leased out to smaller farmers. But a lot of the smaller farmers are the ones that will get screwed if those big factories need their own capacity. And so there's also a pretty major lack of abundance in the ability to process more tea. So here's what Paul writes. These factories are exceptionally costly to construct and maintain. Among tea factories, they are a rare sight, referring to tencha factories. Certain regions or prefectures specialize in producing a particular type of tea, leading to a higher presence of these factories. For instance, Kyoto Prefecture is home to numerous large, established, high-capacity facilities with their own brands. These facilities often offer some of their capacity overhead to smaller farms, providing them with managed production space. Smaller farms can benefit from a well-run production process with skilled operators, eliminating the need for them to manage grinding equipment in addition to their usual farming responsibilities. As demand increases, these overheads are starting to be reduced, but production capacity remains unchanged. The decision of these factories to reduce available spots for smaller clients has left farms scrambling to find alternative facilities to produce their goods. While it may encourage some farmers to establish their own processing facilities, I doubt it will be a widespread trend. The time to invest in the construction of a tencha facility was a few years ago, and some farmers did in several prefectures, and my hope is that it is paying off for those who took the courage to invest in one at the time. More likely, farmers will simply move to another factory that may not have a brand identity and focus solely on offering refining, blending, or grinding services, for instance. Even well-established brands are struggling to keep their stocks at bay, as you can read from MK's announcement. So you can see how this affects the bigger picture. While restricting the quantity of products available feels only like a patched temporal solution, there is not much that can be done. Even with all the production capacity available, if there's no high-quality leaves available, there's not much that can be done.
Yeah, very interesting. Like, it's not like the production, the sheer capacity of producing matcha becomes the bottleneck at this point. It's super asset heavy. It takes time and takes money to build a new one. And a lot of these smaller, more boutique farmers just don't have the ability to construct one, which is very sad.
It's very sad. And Paul goes on to write that some regions might only have one of those facilities, which limits leaf intake of that area. Consequently, this often prevents individual farmers from selling their own products because they sell leaves to the company at the price set for that regional factory. So this creates a complex relationship between the factories and the farmers who collaborate with them. While some areas have excellent cooperation between farmers and factories, others do not. Occasionally, farmers may band together to establish their own factories and gain control over their livelihoods. However, this practice is becoming less prevalent as fewer farmers are willing to undertake the challenging and physical demanding task of farming. The mere cost of the equipment and building the factory can result in substantial starting debt. Actually, there's a
Yeah.
similar problem in the coffee world where a lot of these farmers just cannot afford the capital equipment and
Mm.
facilities to do their own processing, which leads to some very complicated dynamics.
And I bet it's not just the capital requirement. Like farming is hard, man. Like, it's very labor intensive, and I cannot think of by the end of the day after finishing taking care of the garden, you need to go to another site to build this factory. Like them must be a nightmare.
Yeah, and think about it from succession planning. I mean, in Shizuoka, the average age of a tea farmer is over 65. I mean, why would
Yeah.
you pursue this at the end of your career when you don't even know if you have a succession plan? Right? So it just doesn't make logical sense for most farmers to do this.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
And interestingly enough, a lot of the farmers that we see Western vendors source from that are very famous, that own their own facilities and the ability to grind or produce tencha themselves, apparently still lease some of it out, or they're buying aracha from other farmers, processing it and selling it under their own labels. So in some way, anyone who decide these small companies that have the resources to commit to this type of equipment kind of become like these larger companies controlling these factories, because that's just the economic model that works.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see maybe one day there might be, foreign vendors or consumers realizing this situation and might also realize this could be a opportunity. Like that there's really a production bandwidth problem going on in Japan right now.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Anything
So
else?
something that Paul, yeah, so something that Paul talks a lot about, and this will be on our podcast with him later, are the producers that are kind of in the middle. And he describes it as either a race to the top or a race to the bottom. We have very award-winning farmers that are well-funded, and can invest in these type of things. And then you have gigantic farming operations that are selling very commodity matcha. And you have a bunch of people in the middle, don't own their own factories and don't necessarily have their own brand or any awareness or language or international skills to build their own brands. Pa wrote, all the medium spectrum of producers are stretched to either produce more at the expense of a ceremonial grade experience, and this was in quotes, ceremonial grade, or attempt to compete in a competition grade, quote, market with significantly higher overhead costs, limited name recognition, and a substantial risk in some of those teas. An entire line of farmers is trying to navigate this market, and they are most commonly found by overseas customers who only tap them because their initial options fail to meet their account's needs. This can be due to pricing or volume issues or both. Sometimes brands simply receive an overwhelming number of outreach from overseas customers seeking products. Those brands and farmers can receive around 600 of such messages annually. So he goes on to write, from there, you're out to compete in a saturated market with minimal regulation. There are factors like labeling terms, regional brand reputation, long-standing company names, or owning and operating your own factories that can give you a significant advantage. So this includes things like award-winning farms, highly sought after by both industry and consumers. In prefectures with long-standing tradition of tencha and matcha production like Uji Matcha, the prefectural tea brand and MK, perhaps, are the most renowned for their private brand strength, consistently ranked as the first choices for their clients overseas. These names are sought after by customers who are often unfamiliar with the product, as a large number of farmers who grow these leaves decrease due to falling prices and the retirement and closing of farms after the COVID pandemic. Many areas have lost a lot of its capacity. It was inevitable that the market would become a race to the top, with customers seeking the highest matcha experiences, while simultaneously competing to the bottom to meet the demand for industrial uses with summer or autumn leaves. These products are commonly ground in more time-efficient methods and appear unable to meet the demand of some customers that demand high volume, low price, stone milled, quote-unquote ceremonial grade tea. This demand is sometimes unreasonable, as most customers seek the product that they can sell using terms like stone milled or ceremonial, but sometimes paying little attention to other aspects. Really interesting. Heavy hitting, too.
Yeah. I mean, for people already on the top, right? Like they already have the reputation. They have the money to keep experimenting and keep making better products, and they probably also have the social connection to maintain their status on the ladder. And for the mass market production, right? Like they probably already invest a lot of money in machineries. And now they already have a pretty sizable production lined up. All they need to do is just buying more machine and expand their garden and make it more flat, so that they can run more GPS controlled, harvesters on their field. And for people stuck in the middle, like where do they go? Like if they want to climb up the ladder, it's very difficult to make good or higher quality matcha. Like every year, the weather is different, right? Every year is almost a different experiment. And if one harvest goes bad for 1 year, like for smaller farmers, that's the end of the story. Like you have no money in your bank. You sell the lot and then you retired early. And on the other hand, it would probably be a very easy solution to just go mass market, sign a big contract with one of the bigger names, and just sell all of your leaf as aracha or even fresh leaf for them to process. And that also means giving up your dream or giving up your generations of, you're giving up your garden that has been taken care of by generations. So it's a really hard decision to make.
Yeah, and investing in quality is a really hard decision to make. This is fascinating. This whole conversation, I never thought about that as an externality. My first reaction was, oh my word, MK is going to run out of matcha. This is great. It's in such a hype cycle. People love it. Maybe people will explore other brands. And then as we dig deeper into this, we're like, wait a second. There's only so much processing equipment. Where are these bottlenecks? And what happens in cases where these gigantic companies run out of stock? And how might that affect other tea farmers? And then, Ian's perspective on like these two distinct markets, both being driven by foreigners, but one domestic and one non-domestic, and where there's sort of fungibility in the ability to produce more or produce less, and what is not compliant, also is not easy, especially when you're not a well-resourced company. So to me, actually, all of this spells out that it might be net negative for small and medium-sized producers that are not already well capitalized, leading to a net destruction of uniqueness and heritage that exists amongst all the tea farmers in Japan.
Not really a bright future as we assess this.
Especially, we're trying to source tea for our mill that can mill matcha fresh. And, the easiest people to discover as Westerners with very limited Japanese language skills are the people that are already on the top. Right? They're the well-funded, well-capitalized
As
groups.
we were bouncing this fresh milled, idea with a lot of these Japanese farmers that we talked to. They seem to be very interested too. So we might actually have a very unexpected market out there, other than uh, Europe and America and Southeast Asia, as we wanted to target initially.
Yeah, it'd be cool to see if that could be a really nice way to change these dynamics, to give farmers more options, to save culture, to give consumers more options. But this was a way more complicated episode to research and record than we were expecting. And we're very grateful for Paul, for Ian, for Cole, for contributing to making this possible with their unique perspectives. So it's nice that we have such a wonderful community to help share knowledge and resources and to respond to this news. So if you enjoyed this episode, or if you have anything to add to the discussion here, if you disagreed with anything we said, or you have a very unique perspective that adds to the conversation, we would happy to release a part 2 and to expand on these ideas further. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us on Instagram or by email on our website, sankomatcha.com, to continue this dialogue. And thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with a friend or giving us 5 stars. And with that, I think that's the end of this episode.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening.